What if the Holy Roman Empire never truly died in 1806, but instead transformed itself into something invisible? An empire without borders, without armies, but one that governs through law, finance, faith, and constitution. In previous episodes or videos, we explored the 16th and 17th centuries, the rise of Rosicrucianism, the decentralization of empire into sub-empires like Britain, France, Sweden, Russia, and the Ottoman world. We traced how chivalric orders, Jesuit networks, and Freemasonry created the scaffolding of a new spiritual political order. But today we move forward. We ask, how did this invisible empire reappear as federal constitutions? How did it reshape nations like Australia? And how did it end feudalism, administer Palestine, and set the stage for the technocratic order we live under now? To answer this, we must revisit a vision first written in the early 1600s. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, a blueprint for an invisible empire, part Holy Roman dream, part Rosicrucian science, and part English prophecy. Was it written for Britain alone, or for a federation of empires yet to come? By the 20th century, constitutional federation became the foundation for global order. Australia, Canada, South Africa, all federated dominions. World War II gave us the United Nations, Bretton Woods, NATO, super-constitutional structures. But this was not a new dream. Francis Bacon had already imagined it in the 1600s. In New Atlantis, published in 1626, Bacon described a secretive island, commonwealth, named Bensalem, a utopian society ruled by a House of Solomon, a college of wise men who unite science, faith, and governance. This, of course, was just after Rosicrucianism was established and published, which was the foundation of esoteric Freemasonry and the Jesuit order. Scholars debate, was Bacon's vision a blueprint for a purely British-led empire, or was it meant as a model for a federation of empires, a spiritual and constitutional order that transcends any single crown? His world drew on Holy Roman imperial ideas, law, science, chivalric fraternity, meaning the Knights Templar, and the unification of religions, but translated them into a Protestant English idiom. In many ways, New Atlantis can be read as the Rosicrucian constitution of the invisible empire. Knowledge is power, science is administration, interfaith harmony as legitimacy. From the 1950s to the 2000s, this invisible empire became technocratic. Finance, law, and interfaith dialogue became its instruments, exactly as Bacon foresaw. Scientific institutions, think tanks, and global councils replaced palaces and parliaments. At the moment, you can think of CNP and Heritage Foundation running Trump administration, creating the turning point of Charlie Kirk, etc., etc. Oh, and running Reagan. His House of Solomon became our global expert class, shaping policy across nations, often without formal accountability. Thus, Bacon's New Atlantis was not simply an English dream. It was a Rosicrucian map, an imperial operating system waiting to be installed. Britain was its first host, but the system was always designed to be bigger than Britain. A federation of empires, a network of invisible governors, the invisible Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is or was Roman law, so representing Constantine the Great, and Germanic constitutional governance, aka Charlemagne, which are the two statues you see here that are at the entrance of the portal that the Pope opened this year, New Year's Eve. It planned centralized nation-state formation and imperial consolidation. So when it dissolved in 1806, it wasn't in fact destroyed, it was restructured by constitution or federal empire. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, the German Confederation, Metternich's diplomacy, the codification of civil and criminal law, all of these reforms sought to replace medieval empire with a constitutional system. Successor states like Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and the German Confederation, amongst Britain and everywhere else, carried forward the DNA of the Holy Roman Empire. They built centralized bureaucracies, codified law, and tried to balance central authority with ethnic and local autonomy, hence interfaith. Hence all the chivalric orders that we've seen before that I've shown you with that whole post and short video of Erica Kirk's necklace, that the chivalric orders were across all sub-empires, including the Ottoman Empire. It didn't matter if you're a Muslim empire, it didn't matter if you're a Christian or empire or so forth, it was across all faiths. The change to federal constitutional empire was the first move towards centralization. It was the creation and union of all of our nations, centralizing our states and putting it under constitution. Even the Ottoman Empire attempted this transformation with the Tanzimat reforms, drafted under the influence of Lord Palmerston in Britain. But where Britain adapted, the Ottomans, Russians, and Germans faltered, and in that failure, Britain rose. In 1831, the Duke of Wellington founded RUSI, R-U-S-I, the Royal United Services Institute. It became a think tank of empire, the intellectual spearhead for Britain's constitutional strategy, its defence arm. Was this the master plan to absorb Europe's collapsing empires, or was it only designed for Britain's sub-empire under the Holy Roman Empire? The truth lies somewhere in between, I think. Britain's federal constitution was meant for its own dominions, but because others could not adapt, Britain's model became the default global system. Where the Ottomans decentralized, Britain centralized. Where Russia sprawled, Britain codified. Where Germany clashed with its imperial heritage, Britain stabilized through constitutional monarchy. Consider Australia. In 1901, it federated into a Commonwealth. On paper, it was free from colonial rule. In practice, it was integrated into a broader imperial system. James Bryce, in his book The American Commonwealth, and later as Britain's ambassador to Washington, or the King's ambassador to Washington, as the King actually phrased it as, inspired much of Australia's constitutional design. This was not independence in the revolutionary sense. It was restructuring. Australia became a node in a federal constitutional empire, one step in the invisible empire's global project. So back to when the Holy Roman Empire dissolved in 1806, as I said earlier, it created a turning point toward modern state building and imperial consolidation. Plans for consolidation after 1815 started with diplomatic agreements like the Congress of Vienna, federal structures like the German Confederation, and political vision like Metternich, as I've shown you before. and legal reforms all aimed at managing sovereignty, nationalism, and multi-ethnic governance with constitution and law. The Holy Roman Empire persisted through successive states, as I've said before. And in 1815, the Holy Alliance by Russia, Austria, and Prussia formed a supra-imperial alliance that influenced governance and reform discussions, coordinating conservative governance and supporting legal constitutional order across empires, or what we would say streamlining, codification of civil and criminal law, centralized bureaucracies, attempts to regulate ethnic and nationalist demands within empires. These reforms sought to build legal frameworks compatible with multi-ethnic governance without destroying state sovereignty. The Ottoman modernization efforts, aka the Tanzimat reforms that I've spoken to you about earlier, were partly attempts to catch up with European centralized governance and military organization, or in other words, they were trying to become a federal sub-empire within the invisible Holy Roman Empire. But internal resistance, complex ethnic divisions, and external pressures limited success. They kept decentralized, and that was the main key issue. Meanwhile, European powers were expanding their influence through diplomacy, financial control, aka debt, and legal privileges, capitulations, effectively eroding Ottoman sovereignty without formal conquest. A really important point to make is that the Durham report that created self-governance in the British colonies under the Holy Roman Empire, meaning when we became independent, Australia, Canada, America, New Zealand, you name it, when we all became independent and self-governing, and then it transpired globally across constitution to self-governing constitutions later on down the track, that was done with the Durham Report in 1839. That was the exact same year as the Tanzimat reform that was proposed in the Ottoman Empire. So this is the British Empire's reform, and the Tanzimat is the Ottoman Empire's reform. And you can see that every empire was attempting to centralize constitutionally under federation. So this was a complete and utter centralization of global power and global order under decentralized sub-empires of the Holy Roman Empire. That's an important thing to note before I move on, because we're at this point, once Tanzimat reform wasn't really working, it took some time. They were also under the advisory. Tanzimat reform was under the advisory, obviously, because it was quintessentially British and Ottoman, like a hybrid reform, written reform guided by Lord Palmerston through Pasha, the UK ambassador for the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was actually being advised by, I think it was France, Russia, like those empires, the Russian Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, to transition. And when they didn't transition, I think it was by 1855, that's when those loans started coming in, the takeover by debt and loans, and the sell by propaganda that the Ottoman Empire was failing because they were bankrupt started to come out with the Crimean War and their need for loans. But that was really a soft power takeover or handover that they knew, that the Holy Roman Empire knew that the Ottoman Empire was not going to be successful in its transition by government, and that it needed to be dismantled, and then the lands and the takeover dispersed amongst the other sub-empires. Yep, so 1855. Britain, Germany, Austria, Hungary fighting over the Ottoman Empire once it was dispersed. And this is in the 1900s, of course, with this image. 1854, the Crimean War was really the trigger point of these loans needed for the Ottoman Empire. But as I said, this was really by design a handover. And I've done this before, but I've already discussed with you that the Rothschilds family, the dynasties, because they're located in each and every sub-empire, back when it was, there was a sub-dynasty of the Rothschilds because they were the merchant bankers for the Holy Roman Empire. They were the ones to give loans to the sub-empires, the ones that were the banking advisory or council of these sub-empires. They were the ones to give loans to the Ottoman Empire. And you can see here, in 1854 and 1855, loans of 3 mil and 5 mil and in pounds were organised by Dent, Palmers and Co. and the Rothschilds of London. So a lot of the time, I just had a comment or a conversation with a Turkish man tonight saying, well, the Ottoman Empire didn't borrow from foreigners. And I said, well, yeah, you're right. They didn't necessarily borrow from foreigners. They were borrowing from the Holy Roman Empire. So conclusively, when the Tanzimat reforms faltered in their goals of consolidation and centralization under the Holy Roman Empire, imperial creditors used debt as both pressure and pretext to seize control, a form of economic imperialism and geopolitical handover. Simply via Rothschild, as I've just shown you, the Holy Roman Empire killed the Ottoman Empire gradually and had others take over. So from 1854 to the 1900s, once the war broke out, or World War I. The weird thing is that 7 years later and 13 years before the official bankruptcy was declared of the Ottoman Empire, in 1862, I think the year that Queen Victoria's husband passed away and the father of Prince Edward, which will become the king of the New Order, the king of the Pilgrim Society, of the Round Table, of central banking, of everything that's happened in America, the expansion to Anglo-America, everything, the technocracy and the systematic order that was then proceeded with after World War II to the 2000s. So the global institutionalization takeover. That was then, after that, the technocratic takeover from the 2000s onwards. That was all under, really, the beginning, the origins were under King Edward. And funnily enough, in 1862, by order of his mother, Prince Edward at the time visited Palestine during the larger Eastern question concerning the Ottoman Empire. How European powers like Britain, France, and Russia engaged with the Ottoman territories with the aim of influence, prestige, religious protectorates, or even territorial concessions. Photography and publication of images from Palestine and surrounding lands served as means of soft power, shaping public opinion back in Britain about the Ottoman Empire, about the need for Britain to play a leading role in the Middle East. And it's very strange because this is all again in 1862. This is not in the 1900s. This is not because Moses Hess decided that the Jewish people needed their own nation or needed independence. It has nothing. That was a front. This was the photography book that was created by during Prince Edward's tour, and this is the group of the elite that went on the tour. And in this tour, as I've shown you recently, Prince Edward went to visit the burial of Abraham, and this is why I have mentioned the Rosicrucianism, because it is the Holy Roman Empire faith, the spirit, the dual system of the spirit and the sword. It moved from papal Rome to Rosicrucianism, so they could decentralize across sub-empires with chivalric orders to maintain order. So Freemasonry, Jesuit order, is a way to control Britain, say, and the City of London and Bank of England. That's the way they did it. Through Rosicrucianism, the one true faith, which is through these orders. And that's why you have the cross, and that's why you have Erica Kirk's necklace, etc., etc. So him going to the burial of Abraham and his wife Sarah is very, very symbolic and significant, because Islam, Judaism, and is it Judaism? Is that how you say it? I don't want to offend anyone. So anyway, the Jewish faith, Christianity, and Islam are all Abrahamic faiths. And in Rosicrucianism, they see the one true faith is the faith before all of those faiths is under Abraham and Noah. But it's before Mystery Babylon. It's before the Phoenicians. It's when mankind was created, really. And so this is why there's a sense of interfaith, and why Abraham is such an important symbol of Rosicrucianism. And Prince Edward going to the burial of Abraham as a non-Muslim, and he was the first, supposedly after 700 years, when the Crusaders found the burial. And the Muslims in Palestine are extremely protective, well, back then when they were still alive, and had Palestine and were living there and were free in Palestine. They were extremely protective of these holy sites, these sacred sites, and they wouldn't let anyone in. And it took a special order under the Ottoman Empire to allow him in Hebron to go. Is it Hebron? I'm not sure. Anyway, to go and visit this burial site. So it was a very big deal, but also very, very symbolic, more than just propaganda itself or political. So these efforts reflected a shared 19th century strategy, using constitutional codification, legal reform, and administrative centralization to consolidate empires and manage diversity under stronger, more adaptable political structures. Russian, Ottoman, and German empires fell due to not being able to adapt the old empire with the new. Not wars like we know, which seem more like a cover for depopulation, threat reduction, once these empires had to be handed over and into new management. Funnily enough, James Bryce, the guy who wrote the American Commonwealth, actually visited Palestine and spoke about the burial sites and so forth. Because back then, when Britain opened up Palestine or took over Palestine, they were allowed to go on tours and excavate sites and so forth. And the Muslims were extremely, extremely protective of the land even then. And he mentions that. And he also mentions the need of Palestine needing a government to rule, to modernize Palestine. But he also mentions about Russia, and he mentions about in 1913 their attempts of government, and that it was just too big and too unwieldy to really govern successfully. And what happens? What happens soon after? And then you have here, under the Federalists, they talk about, I think it's a bit blurry, so I do apologize, but they do talk about the German Empire, or the German Empire, and how they were ruling with both constitution, but also these families, these whole Prussian. I think they had a mix of kings or monarchs within Germany because of the Holy Roman Empire, and it just didn't work. It was just too messy with the conflicting powers of state and then these dynasties. And then with the Ottoman Empire, as I've just briefly gone over, it was just too decentralized. And they had a really hard time with the elites and getting around the elites and the funding of those elites that really ruled the Ottoman Empire, along with obviously the Islam faith, or Islam law and so forth. So Prince Edward, which will soon become King Edward, when he toured visited the burial site of Abraham, it wasn't just a pilgrimage, it was a symbolic claim, an esoteric Rosicrucian moment. And when World War I was won by Britain, from 1917 to 1920, Palestine was governed under OETA, the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration. Now, that really was a transition administration for 3 years, just like the proposed GITA, G-I-T-A, administration of Tony Blair that's been allowed by Hamas, by Netanyahu, and by Trump, which is what I've got in a short video that I've put up recently, talking about the technocratic governance that Gaza will be under with this Tony Blair GITA administration. This is Bryce talking about the need for government in Palestine, just to be a little more relevant when I'm talking about this. So after the OETA, or the Transition Administration, took place up until 1920, after that, Britain then imposed civil rule, modernising the land. James Bryce, as I've said, once wrote, "As long as Muslims reigned in Palestine, the land was protected." The Ottomans had acted as custodians, but when their empire collapsed, Britain stepped in with political, religious, and symbolic purpose, and ready to centralize with constitution. Here, empire touched the sacred, and the invisible empire showed its true face. So when Charles speaks of interfaith, it's because he knows that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all seen as branches of a primordial Rosicrucian faith. The invisible empire continues its mission under new names and new faces. So we return to the question, did Britain plan the fall of rival empires, or did it simply succeed where they failed? The answer, I believe, is Britain's federal constitutional empire was designed for itself. But its adaptability, its legal frameworks, its financial systems, its constitutional monarchy made it the inheritor of the global mantle. But I could be wrong. The invisible empire, though, it survived of the Holy Roman Empire, not through conquest, but through law, finance, and the quiet restructuring of nations, our constitutions. And it is still with us today, legally, now systematically, and now moving on to a technocracy, centralized, globalized order.